Welcome to the neophytes of narratology, the internet's most pretentious and pseudo-intellectual pursuit since, perhaps, Nietzsche's thus podcast Zarathustra, or Camus' renowned vlog of Sisyphus. While lesser men aspire to stand on the shoulders of mere giants, we at the Lost Signals will accept nothing less than titans. So join us as we delve into the fundamentals of narrative nuance and critique the critics who proclaim to know the universal qualities of effective storytelling. Hello, and welcome to a new segment called The Neophytes of Narratology, where we are attempting to build our credentials as critics by looking into ancient and contemporary views of narrative and really kind of discuss what narrative is. So today we're going to be discussing Aristotle's Poetics. I'm Jonathan Ian Manser, here with Scott Thurlow.
Hello. Just to be clear, I am not a neophyte of anything.
Yes. And Stephen Hermosi. and Stephen Hermosi.
Hi. I've been known to be a neophyte before.
All right.
So Scott, would you like to give a overview of what Aristotle's Poetics was about before we go into our in-depth discussion?
Certainly. So basically the structure of this piece is how to structure a good narrative. He goes into various, I think there's 6 divisions we'll get into, like basically breaks them down under banners such as character, etc. And yes, he's using the Greek plays that were contemporary at the time, but nevertheless he tries to sort of filter out what makes a good narrative and why, and what elements should be included and how you should include them and use them in a work.
So, actually, now that you brought that up, I would like to discuss what the 6 parts were.
Okay.
Now, to be clear, supposedly this is part 1 of 2 segments that were intended. We only have the first part of Poetics.
Right.
This details tragedy, though he covers kind of an introductory bit about comedy.
He cursorily mentions comedy a bit, yes.
But then he goes in depth with tragedy. So if you only know that Poetics, it seems like he's very dismissive of comedy overall. But the 6 parts are, and in order of importance to
which I think is important in of itself, the way he structured it. Go on.
Is the plot, then the character, then the thought, the diction, the song, and the spectacle. And we will go in depth into what all of them mean as we proceed with this discussion. But let's start out with plot. Do you guys want to have any an initial discussion about that?
Sure.
Well, I mean, plot being the most important to Aristotle, the first thing he names, and he goes really in depth into how to create a good plot that that can grab an audience, and he talks a lot about it. I thought it was kind of interesting how he breaks down like every part of everything that he talks about in great detail. And
well, he's Aristotle, man.
I mean,
he's a good philosopher.
I'm going to kind of go away from talking about plot right now and talk more about the book as a whole.
Okay.
But
fair enough.
It's pretty incredible to me that he has this whole idea about what narrative is, and he portrays it all within, 50 pages? This
Something
really
like that.
short period of time, and just gets a lot of what a lot of people talk about when they talk about a good narrative.
Well, I think I'm the only one here who has formal education into Aristotle.
Yes.
So
I learned a little bit about him in philosophy class 101, but
I know who he is, and Socrates too. Go on.
So Aristotle, supposedly we don't have any of his what intended to be read,
his actual essays, say,
or anything. These are more of, in a sense, either almost like lecture notes, if you want to think about that. So, but he is huge into categorization, and that's what he did.
That's obvious.
Everything he did, and he views everything through that lens of let's break down the principal parts of an object, and then all the
constituent elements. Yeah, sure.
So I found it very I've read many. This is the first time I'm reading Poetics, but I've read his ethics, kind of the analytics, and his sciences. So he's to see it applied to something kind of more artsy, to use it in the
cultural,
in the
not
sense
science,
of the current
really?
term. Yeah, cultural it was very fascinating, and he uses the same kind of methodology about it.
Well, yeah, I agree with that. It was kind of not jarring, but interesting at least to read a treatise on, like you said, more artsy, I guess, culturally centered element rather than, quote unquote high philosophy in science. But nevertheless, as you said, he uses the same methods to sort of take a scalpel to it and analyze what makes it, what the parts that makes it tick, essentially.
And he also wrote a book on rhetoric.
Yes.
In the same
True.
vein. Actually, they were taken to be part of the same work, I think, originally, but now they're kind of separated into their own specific parts, because rhetoric obviously goes more into politics and talking to someone.
And there's also a school of thought that rhetoric should be included with his methods of analysis.
Right.
Yeah.
So it has to go with topics or posterior analytics and prior analytics. So you're right about that point. But so maybe going into plot right away will be doing him a disservice.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps we should begin by starting where he started.
Okay.
So I think it was very interesting and how he defined poets to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
That art, and in the sense we're using art as in the sense of the current one, and not kind of how art was designated back during the ancient Greek, which was more of like a skill or a craft. How it's an imitation of life, and I think that's a very interesting kind of very true.
He says that phrase a number of times, and it's sort of like to reinforce the point, like what we're analyzing is something that is intended to do that, and that's its whole point. And then and it goes looking deeper into how well and how you can effectively do that, or sometimes fail to.
I feel that's pretty heavily influenced by Plato, almost.
Sure,
that he
the
idea of it being like not the real image of the world, but kind of a secondary,
an exaggerated kind of. Sure.
Oh, and he uses exaggeration quite a bit too.
He does. You're right.
And I think it's also kind of interesting that it's looked at from this kind of scientific point of view. That this is here's the notes for making a good story, which I'm always interested to read it because everybody does it differently. But this is cool to see like where that kind of came from,
One of the, I think we're saying it's very interesting. The entire thing is incredibly interesting. And as everyone can see in my notes, I actually have emboldened interesting.
Yes. We can agree that it's interesting.
Yeah.
Yes,
This point here, that poets are defined by the structure they use. So epic poets use a certain verse style where like tragedy and comedy all do different kind of have their own unique style to it, and that's how I feel that even applies to today. You have it's not really about the message that you're trying to send, but more of like the tropes and the stylistic choices that define where you sit in a in
cultural range, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, I agree with that. Again, yes, he sort of saw he laid out the outline of that even back then, and it's still I think the thing that we're going to say a lot, and I'll just start off saying it here first, is that almost everything that he writes about is perfectly applicable to still now in the modern day to any story you can see in any medium.
Right. At least his theoretical ideas about narrative.
Exactly.
Maybe not his social.
Okay, sure, right.
His social.
So that's why I said
but,
most of it,
yeah.
but no, the actual, let's say, quote unquote, scientific study of the art.
Right.
I think is still valid, and perhaps more people should maybe read Poetics, and if you're working on anything
But I mean, I think that speaks to the universality of writing a story. I mean,
agreed, of course,
and that's been said 1,000 times before. Anybody who's looked at anything about writing has heard that same thing. It's a universal way to among humans transfer knowledge.
Fair enough. I guess my point is just that perhaps instead of taking a screenwriting class, more people should be told to read this.
Oh, talking about universality, one of Aristotle's big points throughout his entire, if you go into metaphysics and physics, is the particulars versus universals. And we're jumping ahead a little bit, a couple parts ahead, where he's discusses history versus narrative.
Yes.
And I thought that was because he says that history is about the particulars and narrative is about the universals, as you just mentioned. So I think what in light of if you don't have the context of how Aristotle views the world, like that will almost seem like a minuscule point.
Yeah.
But to really discuss how, like the power of narrative in his concept of universals is really highlighted there.
Well, yeah, he even makes a point of saying, if I remember correctly, right after that, how that fact makes a narrative so much more important than a history.
Yes, he does. Because I have that line broken out when we get to it. But
because he's talking about how if you can talk about something that encompasses all of humanity, it's so much more important than what happened on a certain day, however long ago. That's only going to affect and apply to so many people.
I'll read you the quote. He says, "Poetry, therefore, is a more philosophical and a higher thing than history, for poetry tends to express universal, history the particular." And he goes on about what you're saying.
But to bring in
I picked that line out specifically because that was...
His concept of becoming an artist at any... and using that in his terms. An artist at any craft is about the knowledge of the particulars. So to really get a concept of the universals, you have to have the knowledge of the particulars first.
To start from.
Sure. And so in a sense, he's kind of saying that history, and he does mention this, that history informs great...
It's a good starting point for your narrative, sure.
Great poetics.
Right.
But speaking of history, he delves into the history of how poetry developed in ancient Greece, which I actually found very fascinating. He starts at saying that humans have two instincts. One is the instinct for imitation, which is how we learn and develop. Children will imitate adults, all that. The second one is rhythm and harmony, which we have a natural instinct for, and together those combined create poetry, which, not having rhythm and harmony myself, I understand. I know I'm no poet.
Well, let's also make sure that we say that when Aristotle says poetry, he means any kind of literature, whether it be poetry, prose. He talks about tragic plays in terms of poetry, in terms of the poetics of them, and he's when he says poetry in this, I think he's pretty much referring to any type of literature.
Well, to our early point, yes, he's using it universally and not specifically in quotes, or italicized poetry,
Right, but when most people think about poetry, they think of verse and things like that.
But I think that even the Greek plays back in that time had he mentions the songs of the chorus, so it has an element of verse in there, regardless of how much prose-like it is.
Right, and he breaks that down too. But
but he also
I think
discusses,
we're agreeing on the broad point.
I mean, he discusses all that in terms of prose works as well. Anything that's not rhetoric, basically. Sorry. Anyway, I just wanted to.
So then he goes into the first division of poetry. He says it started with the heroic style, which is either kind of doing the epics of heroes that have existed or hymns to the gods. And those were noble portrayals of individuals. And then they had... It's interesting that I'm wondering what the actual translation is. He says satire, and then they use the lampooning. And we have those definite ideas of what lampoons are and what satires are this day.
Right, but what did he mean in context?
It seems that they were talking about specific attacks against individuals, almost like an Aristophanes style.
Right. Like assassination plays, essentially, like character assassinations, if you will.
Yes. Which were ignoble portrayals of people. So, and from there developed tragedy and drama, and comedy from both of those.
Right.
And again, he seems very dismissive of comedies. I imagine what I've gathered from this story, he didn't have a particular sense of humor.
Well, the thing that you mentioned was that he's not. It seems like he's dismissive because he's focusing on tragedy in this part, but as you said, he did write one about comedy. We just don't. It has lost.
Also, let's hold on before we go any further. Let's define tragedy and comedy in terms of what they were to Aristotle. They weren't exactly what you think of today,
right?
In terms of tragedy and comedy, tragedy basically was just anything with a bad ending for the hero, and comedy was basically anything with a good ending for the hero.
I disagree with that interpretation because he says that's a perfect tragedy with a bad ending. You could have a tragedy tragedy is, he defines it as changes in fortune for both either from a good to the bad or from a bad to the good. And
No. He says that it's from bad to the good if for the bad yeah, right. So if it's a bad character, if he changes from bad to good, does he say that's a tragedy?
Yes, and
that's a way to write tragedy?
he said that when, for instance, if a tragedy has a good ending, it's more in line with a comedy than his definition of a tragedy.
Right.
Yeah.
So as the reversal of fortune and the serious tone of it makes it a tragedy. Where I guess a lighthearted tone would make it a comedy. Again, we don't have his discussion on what a comedy is, but I think that this is a question I think is an appropriate time to ask this question. How objective versus subjective do you feel that Aristotle was during his discussion? Because personally, I felt that it started very objective, and then it became more and more his personal taste as it went on.
Yeah, I mean, he certainly, and like as it goes on, he certainly drops more and more like lines from other plays that he liked, and talks about how awesome they were. Like, he's basically just the first critic talking about how awesome he thinks things are, and even though Scott, I think you got a...
No, it's funny because that's a really good question. I agree for the most part with that sentiment. Like it started off very like breaking it down scientifically, and then he started sort of veering off to like, but this one was good because I liked it, like etc. Yeah. But it's funny. He basically criticizes critics as well towards the end of Poetics, which I found like that was an amusing part to me, and I had a couple quotes from it. But I agree. Like, yes, it starts off objective. I think it all still stands. His analysis is fine. Just that maybe later on, some of the evidence that he uses to back it up perhaps becomes more subjective, or was to him.
I think we should maybe think about this in terms of how this came about too, right? So this wasn't. I don't think that did he like write this all down, or was it like, or were these like class notes?
No, like you said, it's basically what remains from some of his teachings, not necessarily. It wasn't,
right. So if he was teaching this stuff,
that's true.
Like over a period of time, as he develops bond with his students, he's clearly going to get more into what like affects him. Whereas at the beginning, you're going to drop like exactly what you think.
Well, one of the major issues we have with studying Aristotle is that we only have contextual idea of what order they came in, and we also don't know if he rewrote a couple of these.
Sure.
So theoretically, Poetics could have been early on in his career, and we don't know. And there's also a lot of his works that did Aristotle create this or not?
That's a fair and good point that we should keep in mind.
Yeah.
The other thing is, if he was doing this over a series of quote-unquote classes, that makes it an episodic work, even though he makes fun of episodic works.
Even though he rails against episodic works, but go on. We'll get to that.
So, and he also briefly discusses the history of comedy, but more so in the fact that comedy was never taken as seriously as epics and tragedies. So thus less was like codified.
It's a less higher.
Yeah.
Well, I think he talks about the emergence of it a little bit, and it would be interesting to see. I don't know. Did we mention this earlier that he wrote this in two parts.
Yeah.
The tragedy part is the first one. The comedy part is lost. So it would have been interesting to read what he wanted to say about comedy, because it seems like he has a place to go. I don't remember exactly what part it is when I was reading, but he talks about and thus tragedy was born from this, and comedy was born from this, and here's kind of the beginning of comedy, and I'll get to that later. And
he basically says we will not be speaking about comedy in this. So he sort of
turn to page 450 for a discussion on comedy.
It feels as if he's brushing it off, but he's just saying that's a different topic for another time, essentially.
Although, again, I did get the idea that he genuinely felt it was a lesser form of...
Maybe he explored that in the lost writings, but I guess we'll never know.
The way that it felt to me was that he thought that it was a developing form.
Okay.
Because it was younger, and
Fair enough.
there weren't many serious comedic writers until fairly recently, at the time of his writing this.
Also, I remember Aristophanes, I believe in Clouds, wrote about how Socrates basically made had a factory for making puffs of clouds, basically, and that was his students' thoughts. So I'm sure that Aristotle was the butt of jokes through comedians. So I could see I'm making a conjecture here, but I could see him being kind of those damn comedians.
Sure.
Wildly conjecturing.
He doesn't like lampooning because he himself is being lampooned, perhaps. But anyway.
So we're now back at actually the 6 parts of tragedy.
Plot.
So let us go where we, about 15 minutes ago, discussed we were going to do plot. Actually, what's fascinating is he discusses right at the beginning, middle, and end. And I want to talk about mots for a second.
Okay.
Because I felt very justified in our development of mots after reading this, because I felt that we
did the same,
like,
did the right
Aristotle
thing.
would approve.
Aristotle approves of mots.
Yeah, I feel that he would.
We're going to add that to our tagline now. Go on.
I would love to ask him. We'll get him on the horn. We'll
Yeah,
find
call
out
him
what
up.
he thinks.
I think he would enjoy a scientific discussion of narrative, and the fact that we kind of unconsciously stole his like.
Yeah, but he would also hate mots because we're critics, and he doesn't like critics.
But he himself is a critic.
Uh-huh.
I think he would hate
he
unscientific.
he also hates hypocrites.
He would hate Fantastic Four. I think that much is clear. Go on.
So
we can all agree.
Yeah, just like us, he discusses beginning, middle, and end, and he says that beginning does not follow like anything through casual necessity.
Yeah.
So the idea is nothing narratively. The beginning should not require any prior knowledge.
Exactly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The middle is basically the bridge between the two, and the end is the natural causal result of the previous actions, and with nothing left unsaid. So, I would generally agree with that.
Yeah.
As a
I definitely would. Well,
fair narrative structure.
I think that I would agree with that. However, I think that there are a lot more breaks that can be made in a natural narrative. I think that while it's a good starting point, if you're actually interested in studying narrative, you should look into other natural breaks and things like that.
Well, to be fair, he does bring up that point later on for contemporary Greek style plays. So, like, and I didn't bother writing any notes about that because it's not pertinent to like our narrative discussion of the day. But I think he said like beginning, then you have a choral section, then you have a. So he did differentiate between.
Right.
But I think for overall broad.
That's what I was going to say. It's more of a broad, like, structuring out of it in an analysis. Not, yes, of course, there's more to it than that, but just for a general, outline again of dividing it up. But I also want to point out one of the lines I thought was great. When he starts getting into that, he points out, he lays out the 6 things that you mentioned, and he says, most important of all is the structure of the incidents, which I think goes back to Mott's. In a sense, we're breaking down the structure of the incidents and how they were structured, and if they were structured badly, it's going to fucking show up in the story. Go on.
I like I'm a big determinist. Oh, and I'm sure we can have another discussion on this one day.
No,
looking at you, Steve.
We're either going to or we won't.
Yeah.
So,
Go on.
So the
Or
concept of
then.
causality across like a narrative structure is very interesting to me that he brought that up. So in this segment, and we're at segment 7, I believe, where he discusses this, it also he brings up the need to balance, in a sense, scope of a story.
Yes.
And he says that epics, which are the precursors to tragedies, require have multiple plots, detail entire wars, something like that, where a tragedy should have kind of a single focus and be a proper he didn't go so far as to say that there should be a codified length of what a tragedy should be, but he says that he stresses the fact that this should be kind of have its proper length and I guess within a couple hours almost. I feel.
Well, he says something like you can use the epic style as a base. So let's say the Trojan War, don't take the whole war, take a single battle or something. I think he uses that exact analogy.
Well, that's why he loves the Odyssey.
Yeah.
Because it takes parts of and the Iliad. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it takes parts of.
I just that was his example of what he wanted. What he's trying to.
I think he says something like you can't see the entire whale, right? I forget what the exact thing he said about it was.
Go.
But but you also have to have context of that there were poets back in this day who told the entire tale of the Trojan War over days.
Right.
So I think he was
screw those guys. Yeah. They're assholes.
It's bad narrative.
Who wants to sit around for days and listen to the entire story of the Trojan War?
We have science to perform.
Yeah.
Sure.
There's science to be done.
So
for those of us who are still alive. Sorry.
So at this point, Aristotle starts breaking down, like, he kind of returns to comedy and starts breaking down all the little subsects of, we delved into his history versus poetry already. So he discusses that, like, while early comedy revolved around kind of real people, and then comedy and tragedy really dissolved with being plot focused first, and then they kind of inserted its people in later. So comedies would, in their universality, could insert whoever they needed, contemporary, to make the point that they wanted to, whereas tragedies are so focused heavily in plot that you can have real life people in there, you can have fictional characters, you can have a melding of the two. I like this quite a bit, that tragedy, even based on real events, like, kind of works in speculation and probability.
Yeah, he did mention that or at length in that one section. I found that fascinating as well.
So in a sense, again, as an imitation, he's reinforcing the idea that, like, even if you're basing, like, the difference between poetry and history is that even if you're basing poetry off of real events, it's kind of facsimiles, and the themes that you want to are more important than, like,
the
historical
actual events.
accuracy.
Yeah, true.
So then, which one of you wants to take over his hatred of episodic content?
Well, I'll start off, I suppose.
Yeah,
yes.
I think you've got the quotes there, Scotty.
Yeah, well, he says, of all plots and actions, the episodic are the worst. I call a plot episodic in which the episodes are X, succeed one another without probable or necessary sequence. Bad poets compose such pieces by their own fault. Good poets to please the players. So basically he's saying all network dramas are terrible because they're episodic.
So I think he obviously has a different idea of what episodic is than we do. The medium of episodic works has evolved a ton since then.
But I would disagree with that, because I think the point he's trying to make is works are at their best when there's a definitive ending already established, where you're not I believe he actually says this, artificially extending the story.
Yeah, he does. He says, as they write show pieces for competition, perhaps we can translate to pleasing the audience, they stretch the plot beyond its capacity and are often forced to break natural continuity, which I think is what you're getting at.
Right, but I think that it's been shown since, ancient Greece that
they can work. He's just saying it's best to do it.
You can work within the episodic within an episodic structure and still create a good and complete story.
Yes, but I feel that most of those that do have a complete story. So if you take, like, contemporary examples like Game of Thrones or Daredevil, which had definite, like, kind of endings, like miniseries work episodically very well. But if you have a undefined ending, generally I feel that those are the type of shows that kind of peter off towards the end.
Right.
He's saying that's the weakest, and I somewhat agree with
well,
that.
I mean, so that can certainly be true, and it happens a lot, but it also can be shown to be not correct. And I think that I think that where Aristotle in this piece that he wrote is coming from is saying that writing in this, he's saying that when you're writing episodically, you are writing something, putting it out, and then trying to figure out what happens next.
Yeah.
Whereas when you write something episodically now, it just means that it's coming out as a series of things that are coming out.
I would agree with that, except before that there's a lot that doesn't have that long-term goal. There are shows that are going into season 13 and people have stopped watching them.
Right,
like,
of course.
And those, again, perhaps if you're doing something like almost segments that don't have an overarching plot line, like that works episodically. But if you have a strict narrative to it, Aristotle is completely right. Aristotle is calling out Lost, for instance.
I knew you were going to say that.
Right. But he's proven wrong by Breaking Bad,
Yeah, but I feel that, again, maybe that's true. Or
the issue is, of course, like, there was no equivalent to him of what we're talking about. So,
right.
It'd be interesting to hear what he has to say about those kind of things.
Basically, my point... Well, I was going to say, my point is that this type of writing has developed in such a huge way since he came out. At that point, it was just writing. Like, if you were writing episodically, it was because somebody asked you for more after you had finished something, and then you were like, okay, and then you just do it.
Sure, right. I mean,
right. nobody went into it with doing something episodic in mind.
It hadn't been invented yet, if you will.
Right.
So, sure, it's sort of unfair to compare one to the other because they're not exactly one-to-one ratio. But nevertheless, I think that his point broadly stands again that it can be weaker and end up feeling watered down if you try to artificially stretch it out, which is what you were saying, which can happen still again nowadays in modern episodic series, if you will.
Now, moving off of episodic to tragedy, I actually kind of disagree with his, because he kind of uses tragedy and drama interchangeably.
Yeah, kind of.
So he says that the point of tragedy is to inspire pity or fear. What do you guys feel about that as the goal of a drama or a tragedy?
Well, I remember reading that line, and I thought it was odd at first, but then the more I thought about it, it's more of a broad thing. It's to inspire feeling in your audience, and yes, he picks those two emotions, I guess, out of it, and perhaps that was the goal of many of the Greek tragedies. But I took more about it's more to have your audience feel something, a connection to the characters in the story, etc. Maybe, if not those two specific feelings, just something and then instead of being bored, or anything else.
Right. I think you play on those emotions a lot. So many a tragedy or many a modern drama will work your emotions, or I think a lot of it is when the two people get together at the end or whatever, that's playing on either your sense of pity for one of those characters or your sense of fear that they won't get together. I think that's why, I think that's at the bones of it, a lot of why drama and tragedy works.
Now, he actually specifically, in a few sections from here, defines fear and pity as fear is watching misfortune to a person we identify with.
Yes.
And pity as watching some, I guess this is someone we also identify with, unmerited misfortune. So do you do those, with that definition there, do you think that drama still attempts that?
Yeah, I think, again, broadly, more or less, they do.
I think,
go ahead.
Yeah, I think a lot of times that's the attempt, but does it always, that's a lot of the problem with current dramas or anything that does something poorly. I mean, it's tough to talk about comedies because we don't get as much into that, and it's kind of a different thing now than it was then. But as far as drama goes, it's pretty similar to the old tragedies in that, yes, I think that to have an effective one, you have to, identify with a character, and then you have to be worried that something bad will, become of them, and everything kind of builds towards that bad thing until something turns it around,
Yeah, but I think I broadly agree with both Aristotle and you. It's that something. Let's see, how shall I phrase it? Of course, you have to identify with the character, but it has to be affecting as well. You can identify and be and still, you know what I mean?
Right.
It's odd, but I do want to bring up something. I know this is maybe jumping the gun a bit, but it is somewhat related to what we're talking about. One of his lines here is, fear and pity may be aroused by spectacular means, but they may also result from the inner structure of the piece, which the better way indicates a superior poet. I took that to mean explosions and so forth can produce, visceral emotion.
Michael Bay, fuck you.
Yeah, exactly. So
Michael Bay, Aristotle's not a fan.
Yeah, he would say fuck off. Of course, he wanted to be more intellectual, if you will. I just thought that was kind of funny, and it sort of highlights even, again, the problem today where spectacle supersedes good writing.
Well, that's why spectacle was the least important one in the list.
I really want to get to section 13, which is good versus bad plots.
Okay.
But we have a little bit to do briefly. So he moves on to the concept of simple plots versus complex plots. Do either of you want to touch that?
Well, I think what he said was for tragedy, complex plots are the best way to go.
Yes. It does outright say that.
But I think he mentions that for comedies, you probably want a simple plot, right?
Well, what is a simple plot and what is a complex plot?
I believe, I forget exactly what the quote was. Scott, do you have the quote on that?
I don't have that one, but I do. He says, a perfect tragedy should, as we have seen, be arranged not on the simple, but on the complex plan. And then he goes into, tell you that. I don't.
Okay, so a simple plot, from what I understand, is kind of, in a sense, a simple arc for a character. There is a reversal of fortune.
Yes.
Without just focusing on that. So it's a character starts off as good or starts off as bad, and switches roles, and that's it.
Right.
Whereas complex plot includes a reversal or a recognition.
Yes, it does explore that at length. Yeah.
And that he also focuses that it must be part of the flow,
right,
of the story, like artificial twists, as you would. So M. Night Shyamalan, Aristotle is not a fan.
That's what it was. That's what it was, right? Like the character has to come to some kind of realization about themselves, and that kind of encompasses part of what makes a complex plot.
Yeah.
That's what I could not remember. For the life of me.
So you got to study with Aristotle more.
Yeah, I got to read this again. Poetics for the second time.
Okay. So then we move on to types of endings. Okay. So there's the reversal of situation, which again is as I'm going to define it, as the logical twist.
Kind of, yeah. I agree with that terminology.
Yeah, like again, Aristotle very much points out that it all has to be natural. If you have kind of a deus ex machina, if you have the gods intervene, if you have
that's cheap
a
and
character
bad
appear out of nowhere, like, it's not a good twist. It has to be all built up within.
It has to be
story.
organic, is basically his point.
Recognition you can have at the end, which is ignorance to knowledge, which I feel is very much in line to what Aristotle is all about.
Yeah.
And that the best is if they're combined. You have I think Aristotle would be a big fan of. It's a Wonderful Life.
All right, maybe he would like
there's
that
that
film.
Recognition and the logical twist at the end.
Sure,
Or The Usual Suspects.
Yeah. Even though I hate that film, perhaps Aristotle would be a fan.
All right, or
it's a funny analogy, yeah.
Or I don't
think he would like the whole Christmas motif, though.
Yeah. So this is one that was kind of a weird. I thought it was so strange because he kind of never discusses this again. It's like one line that he throws in here, but the scene of suffering, is a type of ending, and he mentions it and then like dismisses it completely. Yeah. So the scene of suffering.
That may go back to what you're saying. Maybe an artifact of again like what he in the times he was writing and what was being produced as entertainment storytelling, if you will. Maybe that was more prevalent, and so as Steve was saying,
stabbing his eyes out.
As it evolved, he dropped off. But
so I'm guessing he's not a big fan of the scene of suffering. So Aristotle would not be a fan.
Yeah,
let's name all the things he would and would not like. Go on.
Okay. And then we mentioned this a little bit earlier that section 12. Now we're on. He focuses on the Greek structure of tragedy, which kind of is not applicable to our discussion of narrative because it's really focusing on what contemporary. So we're on to good plots versus bad plots, where I think this is where he's at his most subjective.
Maybe.
Possibly. Well, he gets more subjective.
He gives 3 plots to avoid in this section, right?
Yes.
The good man going from happiness to misery.
But not just a good man. It's more of like a perfect man. So like kind of the ideal, like Hercules or something like that. Like,
right.
No, Hercules is a flawed character, but the idea of an unflawed character, just bad things happening to him.
Yeah. The bad man going from misery to happiness. Don't do that one. And the last one I thought was the most interesting. The extremely bad man going from happiness to misery, because it won't move anyone to pity or fear.
No one gives a fuck yet.
Yeah. No one cares about the extremely bad man, I guess.
So, yeah, to discuss that a little bit, you have the downfall of the like, kind of perfect man is just a shock and not a fear of pity. Because I feel that you can't identify with a perfect character. Actually, in our recent discussion with The Martian, we actually some of us criticized that.
Yeah, it was a bit of a Gary Stew.
Yeah.
Which, listen to our tropes
we'll
discussion.
Tell you what that means in a later episode, but yes.
But like, I couldn't really identify with the character because he was so good at everything. that like he'll overcome whatever misfortune's happening to him.
Right.
So if that is to be interpreted with the point Aristotle was making, I think that's an incredibly valid point.
I agree with that.
The rise of a bad man is interesting, as I have it here, which is it's alien to the spirit of tragedy. So well Scarface, Aristotle would not be a fan.
Well, he still has the fall at the end. Like, I think this is like...
Well, that's why it's a good
I think
tragedy.
that the ultimate end is like the bad man enjoying happiness. That's what you shouldn't go for, is what he's saying.
And then the downfall of a villain is moral, but again, as you mentioned earlier, is not is morally correct, but does not bring out pity or fear.
Right.
So this was very interesting. I feel that he really describes the tragic hero in what he identifies as the perfect protagonist. In a sense,
yeah,
it's a person who's neither like perfectly good or perfectly evil. He has vice or depravity is not his big sin, but he has kind of a frailty or error that kind of the definition of the tragic hero.
Right.
And that is what really someone we can identify with, and we can all identify with the our own failings.
Right. Well, as I was saying earlier, it's an imitation of life, and the natural instinct for that. And if you like, that's the most I would say realistic depiction of a character who is flawed. Yes, he has strengths, and he also has weaknesses, and that because that's more realistic than rather someone who's like totally morally good or totally morally bereft. Then that's what makes it a good character, thus a good story.
I really like the idea of you just mentioned it, so it made me kind of think of it. But the idea of imitation that goes through this whole work is he kind of talks about how all of this stuff is imitation, and then he kind of gives this, most of art is imitation, and then there's this like other little bit of like if you're a true genius, if you can make something completely new out of all of the things that you're imitating, which I think is a cool idea, and something that probably everyone that's written anything is trying to grasp, in
including
some way.
us, yes, but.
But I don't know. It's just something that I thought about the entire time that I was reading.
Idea that struck you, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Now this is an interesting one. I kind of agree with, but I'm wondering if you guys would disagree with this. I like when a theme is singular and focused, and Aristotle seems to enjoy that as well. I feel that if you throw too many themes into a movie, it can obfuscate what you want to say.
Just a movie or anything, really.
Or anything, yeah.
Sure, but I'm just busting your
And he seems to be of that mind too, that it should be focused on I'm not to say that there shouldn't be like depth to the work, but if you want to have a message, it should be like the main point.
Well, he does say, like, this is in a section just before you're talking about, but he does say a well-constructed plot should be singular in its issue rather than double, as some maintain, which I somewhat do agree with you, like, largely I do. Yeah, of course, it's going to be easier to get your message across. There's only one message that you're, however you're trying to do it, rather than having, let's say, 5 themes or messages or whatever, that you're trying to throw in, and that may confuse audiences. That's always going to be the case, I would think. Mm-hmm. Certainly, there are limited cases where you can try that and get away with it and it works, but it's always going to be easier and perhaps, more importantly, more effective if you keep it simple and straightforward.
That's
kind of
what I was going to say. There are definitely works that are very broad in scope and like just tackle a lot of different issues. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is probably not it's good. It's an awesome work. Maybe not the best instance of this, but like if you think about Game of Thrones, like that's such a wide variety of things that are happening, going on, like issues that are being tackled.
Would Aristotle hate or love Game of Thrones?
I'm going to say he would, but not as a tragedy. He would as an epic.
He would like it?
He would like it as an epic because it fits in his definition.
Well, that's
of epic.
That's the question I'm asking you guys. Yeah.
And I just said Game of Thrones, but what I really meant was Song of Ice and Fire because that was the first thing. The books, but
take it easy.
Yeah, I mean, like that's a work that encompasses a lot of different ideas and just a ton of different ways of going about like looking at them, even.
Sure.
Because there's so many different viewpoints that you're coming at the work through.
Right, but I guess what we're getting at, or at least what I was trying to say, perhaps you agree with this, is that yes, there are certain outliers of works that can do that, but by and large, it's probably best to not try that and keep it more focused and narrow of a range.
I don't know. I think that if you're trying to do something and you really want, and that's what you really want to do,
Right, well,
then try it. Like if it doesn't work, it's not going to work.
Well,
if it works, it'll work.
I think what he's saying, it depends on the format. Like, yeah, certain, like in a more limited format, which is what he's largely again writing about, and even you can translate that to modern formats today. It's a better practice is to keep it focused and constrained in terms of that.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, it depends on the story that you're trying to write. Like, and I think like as not that I should be giving any advice to anyone, but like as advice to if you're trying to write something is don't let yourself be constrained by that. Listen, you should probably learn how to write a single plot before you try to write a lot of plots into one story.
Sure.
But I mean, some of the best stories come out of like things that were just an experiment or like,
fair enough, yes, but it takes a certain kind of talent to pull off. But you maybe think of something funny. Another quote that he had that this is more humorous. I have it's about editing that I took it. He says, "For a thing whose presence or absence makes no visible difference, it is not an organic part of the whole." So basically, he's like saying, take all your shit, take all the crap that's unnecessary out of your play.
Yeah.
So there's 2 more sections to his discussion of good plots versus bad plots. So the change in fortune, as you mentioned earlier, he feels should be a tragic hero should have tragedy befall him. It should be from good to bad and not have a down on his. He wouldn't like Charlie Chaplin. Aristotle would not like him. And I don't know. I'm torn by that. And this is I want to move into ending before we discuss this. His perfect ending is one where everybody dies. And now, so I have a question.
That's mine too.
So The Departed. You would love
Aristotle
that movie.
Would love The Departed. Is Aristotle like a big fan of downer endings? In general, does he like a depressing story?
I think he does, because that's what life is, a series of down endings, man, as to quote Clerks, which he may also like. But like I think his point more is like
he liked the original
yes,
ending.
That's sure, true, good little catch there. But to answer the actual question, I think he's saying it's maybe more, you can connect with it more, maybe it's more true to life. Like you often most people experience misfortune rather than fortune at the end. I don't know.
But he also says that the secondary type of ending is one where there's a happy ending, where like kind of enemies end up uniting against another force and that. And he says that it shouldn't count as tragedy because that's more in line with comedy, and that tragedy shouldn't have a happy ending. So Hollywood shoo-ins of a happy ending to a depressing movie, Aristotle would hate.
That's like 1,000 movies there.
Yeah,
or more.
I mean, that's kind of what I was saying earlier about his idea. I mean, basically the overall idea of tragedy versus comedy. I mean, even up through like Shakespeare's time was, if it's a sad ending for the hero, it's a tragedy. If it's a happy ending for the hero, it's a comedy. Regardless, there were comedies that, were like lighthearted and had probably a couple funny moments, but weren't all that funny overall. Like the idea of a comedy wasn't that it was funny; it was that it was lighter and had a happy ending. And
except for Very Bad Things, which is a comedy, and also I think Aristotle like
that. Maybe I can see that.
All right, so when we come back next time, we will be moving on from plot and going into character and every other aspect of what makes a good narrative tragedy. This is Jonathan E. Manser here with Scott Thurlow.
I, of course, have no character whatsoever.
And Stephen Ormosi.
You guys have a good night.
And Aristotle would like this podcast.
This has been the Neophytes of Narratology. We hope that you've experienced an epiphany or two of the literary nature, but only metaphorically, of course. Music by Christopher Morgan. Editing and engineering by Stephen Ormosi.